The bread was already cooling on the rack when I heard her come to the back door. She always used the back door, said the front felt too formal for family. That was 7 years ago, and somewhere along the way, the habit stopped feeling like love and started feeling like she owned the place. My granddaughter Wren was supposed to be at school. I wasn't expecting her until 3, but there she was, still in her yellow rain boots, her backpack dragging behind her on the kitchen tile, and her eyes holding something that didn't belong on an 8-year-old's face. "Grandma," she said, and she said it quietly, the way children say things when they've been carrying them too long. "Is your house going to belong to Aunt Brynn after Saturday?" I set down the dish towel slowly. "What did you say, sweetheart?" She climbed onto the stool at the counter without taking off her backpack. It made her look small and burdened at the same time. "I heard Mama talking on the phone last night. She thought I was asleep. She said Aunt Brynn was going to take care of everything after Saturday and that you'd be—" She paused and looked down at her boots. "She said you'd be taken care of." The bread smelled warm and good and completely wrong for that moment. Who was she talking to? Wren shrugged one shoulder. "I don't know." She was whispering, but she sounded happy. I smiled the same way I imagine every grandmother has ever smiled when trying to shield a child from something that hasn't finished arriving yet. I told her it was probably nothing. I asked her if she wanted jam on a slice. She said yes, please, and I gave her the thick piece from the end of the loaf because she always liked that best, and I stood at the sink running water I didn't need while my mind went somewhere else entirely. Saturday was 4 days away. My daughter Brynn had mentioned it as a casual thing, just dinner, a chance to catch up. She'd even offered to bring food, which should have told me something right there, because Brynn hadn't brought food to my house in 11 years without wanting something in return. I moved through the rest of that afternoon, the way you move through water, present enough to function, but slowed by everything underneath. My late husband Clive had built this house with his own hands, or close enough. He'd drawn the plans on graph paper at our kitchen table in 1987. He supervised every nail, every crossbeam, every window placement. He said he wanted to build something that would outlast him. He was right about that. The house was still standing. It had good bones. I had heard that phrase from a real estate agent once at a neighborhood meeting, and I'd thought, yes, that sounds exactly like what someone says before they take something apart. When Clive died, he left the house in my name. The land, too, just over 2 acres at the edge of town where the subdivision hadn't yet swallowed everything. It wasn't grand, but it was ours. And then, gradually, slowly, in the way that gradual things can sneak past you, it became something else, a resource, a fallback, a solution my children never had to worry about because I was still here, still steady, still managing. My son Dale had borrowed against his retirement twice in the last 5 years. Both times, I'd written checks without being asked twice. When his wife left, I let him stay in the spare room for 4 months. When Brynn's catering business failed, I covered the lease on her commercial kitchen so she didn't lose her equipment. When she needed a new van, I co-signed. I never thought about whether I should. They were my children. That was simply what you did. But there's a difference between choosing to give and having it assumed. I had started noticing this shift the year before, but I hadn't let myself name it. The way Dale would mention, offhand, that the property taxes on the house were a lot for one person to manage. The way Brynn would look around the rooms when she visited, not with nostalgia, but with a kind of quiet measurement. The way neither of them asked what I was thinking about doing with the place, as if the question of what came next had already been settled somewhere I wasn't invited. That evening, after Wren went home, I called my friend Opal. Opal had known me since I was 32. She'd been at my wedding and at Clive's funeral and at my 70th birthday, which I'd tried to cancel, and she'd refused to let me. She answered on the second ring. "It's me," I said. "I know it's you." "What happened?" I told her about Wren, about the yellow boots and the backpack and the word taken care of. I told her about Brynn's dinner on Saturday and the van I'd co-signed and the commercial kitchen and every other check I'd written without a second thought, and how none of that had ever felt like weakness until the moment my 8-year-old granddaughter looked at me with worry she didn't know how to hold. Opal was quiet for a moment. Then, "What's happening Saturday?" She said, "Dinner." "Mm-hmm." A pause. "And when's the last time Brynn invited you to dinner without meeting something?" I didn't answer that. "Listen to me," Opal said, and I could hear her leaning in the way she does when she's about to say the thing no one else will. "You are not old. You are not confused. You are not a burden. But someone in your family has decided to tell themselves a story about you where you are all three of those things, because that story makes it easier to do what they're planning to do, and you need to get ahead of it before Saturday." "Brynn wouldn't. She already is," Opal said, not unkindly. "You just told me she is." I sat with that for a while. The clock in the hallway made its small sound. Outside, the oak tree Clive had planted from a sapling was silver in the evening light. "What do I do?" "First thing tomorrow," she said. "You call your lawyer." "Not theirs, not the one Dale recommended 2 years ago. Yours." The next morning, I called my attorney. His name was Prescott. I had used him for years and trusted him completely, and when I told his receptionist it was urgent, she put me through before the end of the sentence. I told him what Wren had heard. I told him about Saturday. I told him I had a feeling, the kind that lives in your chest before your brain can explain it, that something was being put in motion. He asked me to come in that afternoon. His office was quiet and familiar. He had a law degree on the wall and a bowl of hard candy on his desk that he'd had there since before Clive died. When I finished telling him everything, he didn't look surprised. He looked steady, which was exactly what I needed. "Have you given either of your children access to any accounts?" he asked. "Brynn was added to my savings during her divorce, just in case." "Any other documents? A medical proxy? Anything related to the house?" I thought about it. "Not formally, but Dale once asked me to put his name on the emergency contact line at my bank. I said I'd think about it and then forgot to say no." Prescott made notes. "We're going to look at everything, and I want to talk to you about your will." "Is it in trouble?" "No," he said, "but it may be simpler than you need it to be right now." We spent 2 hours going through the structure of things. Clive and I had written a will years ago that split everything evenly between Dale and Brynn, which had felt fair at the time, before fairness became complicated. Now, Prescott suggested we revisit the language. He talked to me about a revocable living trust, about naming an independent trustee, about what it would mean if either child ever tried to petition the court over my mental capacity. "That's what you're worried about," I said. It wasn't a question. "It's the most common angle," he said. "And you said your granddaughter mentioned something about being taken care of. In legal terms, that phrase tends to precede a guardianship attempt." I thought about Wren, the way she'd said it. Mama sounded happy. I didn't feel angry in that moment. I felt something colder and more useful than anger. Clarity. "What do I need to sign today?" I asked. We began immediately. I updated my will, adding precise language about my capacity, my intentions, and the conditions under which either child could and could not act on my behalf. I revoked Brenna's access to my savings account. I removed Dale's name from the bank contact line. I set up a trust with Prescott named as trustee and myself as the sole beneficiary during my lifetime. When I left his office, the afternoon light was long and golden. I drove home through it and made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table where Clive had once drawn house plans on graph paper, and I felt, for the first time in days, that I was standing on solid ground. I hadn't told Dale any of this. I hadn't told Brynn. I went to her dinner on Saturday with the dish of potatoes I made myself because I was raised to bring something, and that doesn't stop being true just because someone has been unkind to you. The table was set nicer than usual, cloth napkins. The good wine glasses, though the wine was a brand I didn't recognize that was trying to seem more expensive than it was. Dale was already there when I arrived, which surprised me, since he lived 40 minutes in the other direction and hadn't mentioned coming. They were warm. That was the thing I hadn't fully prepared for. Brynn hugged me at the door and said she'd missed me. Dale helped me with my coat and asked about my garden. We made it through the soup before either of them said anything that mattered. It was Dale who started. He set his spoon down and looked at Brynn first, a small confirming glance, the kind that happens when something has been rehearsed. "Mom," he said, "we've been talking, and we want to be honest with you because we love you." I looked at him over my glass. "It's just that lately, we've noticed you seem a little overwhelmed. The house is a lot to maintain by yourself. The finances, the upkeep. I had someone here last month," Brynn added, softer. "And I noticed some things. The back gutter, and there were bills on the counter that looked a little unopened," Dale said. "I had been traveling," I said. "Right, of course." Brynn smiled the way you smile when you've already decided not to believe someone. "And we're not saying anything is wrong, Mom. We just thought, since we both want to help, maybe it makes sense to formalize it a little. Just a safety net." Dale reached into the bag he'd placed beside his chair before dinner and brought out a folder. I recognized the folder, not that specific one, but the idea of it, the weight of it, the particular gravity of a document someone else has prepared for your signature. "It's just a power of attorney," Brynn said, "so we can help with the house and the accounts if you ever need us to. It's not transferring anything. It's just in case," Dale finished. I reached out and took the folder. I opened it slowly, let my eyes travel across the first page. My hands were completely steady, which surprised me a little. I had expected to shake. I didn't read the documents. I already knew what they said. I set the folder down on the table beside my potatoes and looked at my children, both of them watching me with that careful, patient expression that people use when they're waiting for a yes that's already been decided. "Can I have some time to look these over?" I asked. My voice was mild, unbothered. "Of course," Brynn said quickly. "Too quickly. No pressure at all," Dale said. I nodded and asked for more wine and let the conversation turn to other things. I asked about Dale's work. I asked about Drain's new client, the one she'd mentioned a few months back. I was present and warm and gave them nothing. When I got home that evening, I sat in the front room with the lights low and thought about every version of myself that had ever lived in this house. The young woman who'd moved in carrying boxes while Clive directed traffic from the porch. The mother who'd hung growth charts on the kitchen door frame. The widow who'd had to learn at 64 that silence is not the same as peace. The next morning, I called Opal. "They brought a folder," I said. "Of course they did. I told them I'd think about it." "Good," she said. "Now listen, before they file anything, you need to document this." We had thought about this. I had kept the text messages Brynn sent leading up to Saturday. I had written down what Wren told me, with the date and the time and her exact words the night she said them. I had notes in a journal I'd started keeping 2 years ago, not for any specific reason, just because a friend once told me that older women who write things down are harder to dismiss. 2 weeks later, Brynn called me on a Tuesday evening, and her voice was different, tighter. She said she'd been doing some research and that she'd talked to a doctor, just generally, not specifically, she said, which meant specifically about what options existed for families who were concerned about a parent's long-term well-being. I let her finish. Then I said, "Brynn, what are you really trying to do?" A pause. "I'm trying to help you, Mom. I've changed my accounts," I said. "I've spoken to Prescott. I've updated my will and placed the property in a trust. If there's something you'd like to discuss, I'm happy to do that. But I want you to know where things stand." The silence lasted a long time. She didn't file. Neither did Dale. Perhaps they knew what I had. Perhaps they ran the math and decided it wasn't worth it. I'll never know exactly what happened in the conversation they must have had after my call because they didn't tell me and I didn't ask. Dale showed up at my door 2 weeks later. He didn't call first. He was alone, and he looked smaller somehow, the way people look when they've been carrying something they're not sure how to put down. He asked if he could come in. I made tea. He didn't apologize exactly. He said he'd been scared. He said he and Brynn had talked themselves into believing they were being practical and that he could see now that it hadn't felt that way. He said he missed his father. He said he thought the house was the last part of his father he could hold on to, and that he'd confused that feeling with something that wasn't his to act on. I listened. I didn't forgive on the spot because forgiveness isn't a reflex. It's a choice, and choices take time. But I didn't send him away either. You could have asked me, I said, about the house, about the land, about what I'm planning to do with any of it. You could have just asked. He nodded and looked at his tea. I'm not going anywhere, I told him. Not yet. And when I do, it'll be on my terms. Brynn and I took longer. She called eventually, and our conversation was shorter and more careful, the way conversations are when trust has been bent, without quite breaking. She said she was sorry for how it had come across. I said I heard her. We agreed to try a different version of the same family. It isn't perfect. Some things don't go back to what they were. But there is still Sunday dinner sometimes, and Wren still comes through the back door with her boots making noise on the tile. And last week, she helped me plant sweet peas along the garden fence and told me about a book she was reading at school and asked if I thought flowers could be friends with each other. I told her I thought they could, that some things grow better when they're close to something they can trust. She seemed satisfied with that. She went back to patting the soil down with her small hands, very serious about the spacing, the way children are when they've been given a real task. The house is still mine. The land is still mine. The oak tree Clive planted is still putting out leaves every spring like it has somewhere to be. I am still here, not taken care of, not managed, not quietly moved to one side of my own life, just here, which is exactly where I intend to stay. I've thought a lot about what would have happened if Wren had stayed asleep that night, if she hadn't heard her mother's voice through the wall, hadn't held those words in her small chest all the way to school and then all the way back to my kitchen. I don't know where I'd be right now. I try not to follow that thought too far. But I do think about it, because the truth is, I almost let it happen. Not because I was confused or incapable, the way they wanted a doctor to believe, but because I had spent so many years making myself easy to overlook that I had almost forgotten I had the right to take up space. That's the thing nobody warns you about when you spend a lifetime giving. You get so good at it that people stop seeing the giving. They only see what's left to take. Brynn and Dale didn't start out as people trying to harm me. I have to believe that, not for their sake, but for my own clarity. They started out as people who were afraid of getting older themselves, of the future, of what it means to watch a parent age and not know what comes next. And that fear, instead of making them reach toward me, made them reach around me. They told themselves a story where their actions were kindness, where the folder on the dinner table was protection, where removing my name from my own life was somehow for my benefit. That story was wrong. But I understand how people talk themselves into wrong stories when they're scared enough and no one pushes back. What I learned, what I had to learn, because I didn't already know it the way I should have, is that wisdom isn't only about knowing the right things. It's about acting on them before the window closes. I knew something was off long before Wren said a word. I felt it in the way Brynn measured rooms with her eyes. I felt it in Dale's careful comments about property taxes and upkeep. I filed those feelings under probably nothing and kept making bread and writing checks and being useful. That was the mistake. Not the giving itself. The giving was who I am, but the silence that came after, the refusal to name what I was seeing, because naming it felt like accusing my own children of something unforgivable. Here is what I know now. Protecting yourself is not the same as attacking someone else. When I called Prescott, I wasn't declaring war. I was simply deciding, maybe for the first time in years, that my own continued existence as a full person mattered as much as anyone else's comfort. Opal knew it before I did. She always does. She's the kind of friend who doesn't soften the truth because she respects you too much to let you stay comfortable inside a lie. Not everyone has an Opal, but everyone deserves one. And if you don't have one, you have to learn to be that voice for yourself, the one that says, clearly, without cruelty, but without apology, something is wrong here. And you have the right to do something about it. Wren is 9 now. She still comes through the back door. She still checks the sweet peas and asks questions I don't always have answers to. Last week, she asked me if people can change. I told her some do. I told her the ones who change are usually the ones who got scared enough of themselves to look honestly at what they'd become. I think Dale is trying. I think Brynn is somewhere in the middle of that process. I don't require them to be finished, to love them. But I also don't require myself to pretend the folder never landed on the table. The house is mine. The land is mine. The oak tree is mine. And so, finally, fully is the life I'm living inside all of it.